I started doing this grid quilting thing when I saw something like this on somebody's quilt once. And I was like, wow, oh my gosh, the way that texture happens. And I was so delighted, and I could see how the texture had happened with the dent stitching and the things that weren't stitched. But what I hadn't really conceived of before was that you can do that in such a regular geometric way that it creates its own textile, really, by doing that kind of stuff. Here's another example of something that was quilted that way in the grid. And it just got me thinking, like, well, how would you do that? And I thought, well, you could draw a grid on first and then do it. And then I thought, well, what if you stitch the grid on first? There were some reasons that I thought that would be helpful. And from that point on, I just couldn't stop thinking, like, oh, you could do it this way. Oh, you could add this. And after just drawing out all my ideas, I knew I wanted to keep teaching it. And so I do have a class on Blueprint that's called Quilting the Grid. And then grids are covered a lot in the step-by-step texture quilting book. Julie says, I want to try gridding a lap quilt with larger grids and slightly dent stitching. Yeah, totally. Maybe I'll find it's not in this book, but I have a sample that I bring to my grid quilting class where the grid is like 3.5 to 4 inches apart. The lines are 3.5 to 4 inches apart, and the circles in it are really loose or they're spirals, and they're really loose and open. So it still has a great drape. It was a really fast way to quilt it up, but it still has that like geometric fun, and there's still some texture happening without doing stuff that's going to take you forever. Yeah, so I think the approach is really scalable. You can do it for like, show winning texture on a very small scale, that dense scale that takes a long time, but you can also just poof it up for a bed-size quilt. Yeah, and I also usually bring to that class a bed-size quilt that I quilted with it, and the lines there are more like 3 inches apart probably, and it's a triangular grid, but it's across the entire quilt, and it's none of that dense stitching, and it's still one of the designs in the book. So what I won't go over, because it's not really suited to a live session, is how you do this stuff, how you get the basic grid. So you can do a basic grid that's straight up and down. You can do one that's on its side. It's still a square grid, but it's rotated. Or you can do a diamond one. And then once you have either of those, you can split them up into triangles. Let's just start with the basic grid here, assuming that you've got a basic grid. And if you want the instructions for those, you could check out the class or the book, or you could probably figure it out yourself, I bet. Okay, so usually where I start my class with grids is with arcs. Arcs are fun, and I think they're fun. They're not going to be perfect the first time you do them. The first time you do an arc, you're going to be like, wait, my arcs when I am on the bottom are so different from the other three. Or there's going to just be one side where you feel like there's just going to be one side probably where you're going to feel like you're missing your mark, and that might get frustrating. But I would love if you would stick with it, because it's going to pay off. Here's an every side arc design. I love how that looks. This isn't a triangle grid, but it also has an orange peel effect in a basic grid. So let's talk about that. I'm going to change my color here so it's easier to see. Okay, so if I'm in a grid space and I just put an arc on every grid line, that's what I'm going for with the whole pattern. The problem with putting it on every grid line here is that I'm stuck where I started, and I want to cover the whole space. So there are ways around that. One way is to do this. You could go one grid line over and then the opposite side of the next grid space, and like that all the way to the end, and then coming back with the mirror of that. And if you do that on every line in the piece, you're going to have the whole thing done. What I don't do this because there's a more efficient way where I don't have to go back and forth as many times. I can go back and forth half as many times, and I like the efficiency of that. So here's how I do that. With that one, I will, instead of doing just one side, I'm doing the opposite. I'm doing 3 sides of the space, but I'm resisting the urge to finish that one up. And I'm going to go to the next square and do the same thing. 3 sides and move on. 3 sides and move on. And it's always the same side that I'm leaving blank or empty because of this. Because when I get to the end, I can come back and fill in that last one. And now I've done the entire row in one pass down and back. Yay, Amber made it live. Good job. And once I'm here, I don't even have to go anywhere because I could do the opposite to do this row. You see how now I'm leaving the top one undone? 1, 2, 3, and now I'm at the end of the row. I can slide back and complete that. So there, you can try this however it makes sense to you. Like if this makes sense to you, go for it, right? If that feeling feels better to you, great. I think that there's usually more than one way to solve a quilting or to approach a quilting design, and whatever way works for you is really okay. If you're liking your results, then you're winning. Okay, so how can we amplify this? Once you feel like you like this shape, you may, I'm just going to draw the whole grid again. You may like adding texture to it. So the thing about grids is there's a math to them. You don't have to do the math if you use my designs, but I'm explaining how this works if you want to think your way through it yourself. Is if you have the same number of things in your grid as sides, you're probably going to end up back where you started unless you're crafty about it like we just were. But if you have one extra, you can usually get to another place and move on. So in that case, let's talk about something extra. Remember when I did all my 4 things, I ended up back where I started. But if I add something extra, I can get away from where I started. So here's what I'm going to add. A little question mark shape, and then echo out of that to the opposite. Yay, I made it to another 4 sides. Question mark shape, and to the other corner. My thing inside doesn't have to be that little swirl though. It could be that I fill in this space. We haven't talked about this much, but that dense stitching that makes the quilting pop, if you just go in there with a diagonal line and fill it in, you'll end up at this other point, and now you can move on. And the same thing. You could put anything you want in the center there, and people get so creative. I love seeing what people come up with. So there's a lot to be explored in that what do I put in the center domain. Other things that you can do with arcs, here's a really, 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 really good one that I want to see people using more. And if you were thinking about what can I do that works really well on a big scale, this works great on a big scale. So you could have your lines pretty far apart and have a lot of room to work with this design within it. But what's cool about the grid is it's giving you the structure. Your piece is already basted, so if you pin base, you can have all your pins out. And you're just focusing on one little square at a time, right? So if you only have to quilt 9 square inches of the quilt at a time, it just takes off a lot of that pressure of like, where do I go? And am I filling in the space evenly? You know where to go. And yes, you're definitely filling in the space evenly. Okay, so here we're in a grid space. And this one, imagine this is a nice big grid. I'm just going to start on the edge instead of the corner this time. And I'm going to make a little quarter circle, a little curve down. If I can angle the glare away. And then once I'm at the other edge, I can just slide along, give a little space, and then go back up to the first edge and slide along that grid line. And this is why I stitch the grid lines instead of just marking them. So we can do this funny stuff like this where we sneak along the grid line and slide along. They don't have to be evenly spaced. And you just keep putting in arcs until you fill in the space. And if there's a lot of space in there, then we've already done our divide and conquer stuff, and we know how fun it can be to put stuff in these spaces that we make. So there I just added a bunch of pebbles inside. I could do pointy lines. I could come over here and add some flower petals. Or I could just leave them blank. And you can change which side of the, or which corner of the grid space you start from. And sometimes they could touch, but that can add a lot of variety into your quilting, and be, you can add a lot of motion where people, it just kind of creates a sense of movement where the eye wants to move around the piece and see what's happening. There's a lot of pausing this morning. I can't imagine why. I just got your book. It's amazing. Thank you, Jen. Elle loves this idea, and so does. So I think the best thing you could do is just to draw a bunch of grids and draw in them and see what shapes are making sense to you. If you do happen to be a Blueprint member, in that class there's downloadable grids that you can just print and fill in, including the ones that are on their point and the diamond and triangle ones. Let's keep going. I have a couple more things I want to teach you about arcs, and then, oh hooray, welcome. I don't know how to say Regalan, I'm gonna say, and I'm glad you found me and us in this morning ritual of drawing. Okay, one more grid here. So your arcs don't need to go, there's one more way your arcs can go. We did point to point and we did side to side, and now I want to do diagonal. Arc. And I can echo that back for a sweet little almond shape. And if I did that across both corners, I think I call that the Winding Ways design, because there's a quilt pattern, a piecing pattern that looks like that too. And I know it's in here, and I'm gonna make you look at it. There it is. You see a little glimmer of it there. What's hard to see in this nice, we liked the close-ups in this book. What's interesting about this is when you get a lot of it, it sort of becomes this sort of mesmerizing design where you start to see like the circles come through that it creates, and it feels like there's a lot of movement in that one too. So how would you do this without ending up right back where you start? So with this one, I work diagonally. I go corner to corner, and then I keep going. I don't finish that shape. And then once I'm at the edge of the space I'm filling, I will turn back around and fill in that whole diagonal section. And let me just stop and say that this is a completely legitimate design all on its own, right? This could be a great way to fill this space. And let's talk about how you can adapt this design for even more texture. What if I echo these, right? What if there was that happening? More texture. Yeah, I like it. You could also do this thing where you're echo, echo, echo. That may be hard to see, but I'll do it again. And then slide up the line to the next space and echo, echo, echo. Two diagonal rows. Echo the big shape, echo that echo, a small echo in the corner, and then move on to echoing the next. Echo the big shape, echo that echo, and an echo in the corner. You're going to get a lot of texture out of that. I see some questions here. Let me see what they say. I'm working on placemats with free motion quilting grids. That is a great way to get to know this method. That's awesome. This book is called Step-by-Step Texture Quilting. I just blanked on the name of my own book. Awesome. Step-by-Step Texture Quilting. You can find it in my store on ChristinaCamelli.com if you want, or lots of places. Your local quilt shop would have it. Your grid designs are really wonderful. I used them on an Amish quilt. Oh, I would love to see that, Patricia. That would be really cool. Or maybe you showed me and I forgot. Apologies. But I love the idea of it on an Amish quilt. It seems like a good fit. Okay, so where were we? I took you down texture lane and forgot that we were talking about this. So I got all of my grids, my almond shapes going this way. all I would have to do then is to go back and do the same thing the other way. This will bend your mind a little. There's like a quarter of you that you're like, what? And so you just have to draw it. And once you draw it, you'll get it. This way, my lines are going this way. So I've made an almond. I'm going to do it in a different color so you can really see, really distinguish. Now my almonds are going over the almonds I already stitched, like that. And then once I've reached the end of the area I'm filling, I go back. I'm doing the same thing with every grid space should have an almond pointing this direction when I'm done. Oh, I didn't do both of them here, sorry. Confusing. Okay, starting from here. So if I was quilting this, and this was the edge of the batting, I would just slide off on the edge of the batting probably. Or if I was in a defined space, then I could just slide along the stitched grid to get to the next one. Isn't it already just like, whoa, 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 whoa. It's very hypnotizing, this design. Okay, but also a little hard to see. One more thing to talk about with that. If you do some diagonal rows one direction and other diagonal rows the other direction, you will get flowers. I'm just going to go and point out really carefully which ones are going what direction. So here I got these reddish ones. Oh, that didn't show up as well as it does here. These reddish ones are going one way and the bluish ones are going the other way. And ultimately it fills in the whole place. This is harder for some people to see, so let me just point it out. Here's a diagonal row. 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 This one, let me say, I started with a blue, and so you can also see that this is a diagonal row, that's a diagonal row, that's a diagonal row, that's one, and that's one. So I did a diagonal row, and then I skipped this diagonal row when I was doing the blues that are going this direction. And then I did the next diagonal row all the way through, and then I skipped a diagonal row when I was going this direction. And then I did a diagonal row. And so these ones, where these red ones are, they were blank when I was done with the blues. And then I started working from the other direction, and it was a lot easier to see which ones were skip rows and which ones were stitch rows, because the skip rows were already filled and the stitch rows were empty when I started. So I skipped this one because I already had it in. I already had a row. And then I skipped this row because it was already filled, and I did this row and skipped that, and that would happen across a whole quilt if you want. So that's a much more spaced out approach. It's probably not as confusing as covering them up to your eyes when you're working. Could you do a lot of things with this? Yes. And what I love seeing in my classes is when somebody's like, oh, I just put pebbles in the middle of my thing. Like, yes, good job, great idea. Or I decided to fill in the edges here and make some more texture. Right on. Those are all great ideas for how to adapt this. And there's probably 1,000 more because we've seen that free motion is so adaptable. So if you have any questions about using these arcs in your grids, let me know. Or if there's any other general questions that I can answer. It is fun taking you into the world of grids because I just feel like it's great for beginners, but it's all